Ulysses was 68 when his world began to blur. Not suddenly, not all at once, but in the quiet, creeping way age likes to remind us that nothing lasts forever. He had always been a man of simple joys, reading the morning paper by the window, trimming the roses in his backyard, and watching his granddaughter chase butterflies across the lawn. But lately, those same joys were slipping away from him. The letters in the newspaper ran together like spilled ink. The roses seemed less vivid, and the sparkle of his granddaughter's laughter lost its edge when he couldn't quite follow her darting form. It was the newspaper that broke him. One morning, as he tried to read the headline about some faraway political debate, the words danced and smudged until he had to set the paper down. He rubbed his eyes, muttered about the light, but deep inside he knew this was more than tiredness. That day, he picked up a pair of drugstore reading glasses. They worked for a while, but the relief was fleeting. Soon he was squinting even with them, pushing them higher on his nose, holding the paper closer, farther, until his wife gently laid a hand on his shoulder and whispered, "Maybe it's time to see a doctor." The doctor's office was sterile, the kind of place that smelled faintly of antiseptic and resignation. Ulysses sat in the chair while the optometrist clicked lenses back and forth, asking which was clearer, one or two. His answers grew hesitant, uncertain. Finally, the doctor leaned back, gave a professional smile that tried too hard, and said, "Age-related vision loss. It's common. You'll need stronger lenses and likely for the rest of your life." The words landed heavy, like a sentence being passed. Ulysses nodded politely, but his chest tightened. Stronger lenses meant surrender, an admission that his eyes, once sharp enough to thread a needle in dim light, were no longer his own. That night, he sat on the porch in silence. His wife brought him tea, but he barely touched it. He thought about the long drives he loved to take through winding country roads, the book stacked beside his bed waiting to be read, the simple pleasure of fixing things in the garage. Would he lose all of that? Would his world shrink into a haze of blurred shapes and half-memories? He felt a stab of fear, not for himself, but for the life he might no longer fully see. The laughter of his granddaughter, the pride in his wife's eyes when he handed her roses. Vision was more than eyesight, it was connection. And yet, in the quiet of that fear, something stirred. Ulysses had always been stubborn in the gentlest way. He didn't rage against the diagnosis, but he didn't accept it either. Instead, he began searching. Not for miracle cures, not for easy fixes, but for some thread of hope that the world hadn't finished revealing its secrets to him. His nights became long hours in front of the old desktop computer, scrolling through articles, studies, and forums. He learned about castor oil, how people swore by it for dry eyes, how some claimed it brought clarity. He tried it, carefully applying drops, waiting for change. There was moisture, yes, but the fog on his vision remained. It was on one of those restless nights that he stumbled upon something he had never heard of before. Bilberry seed oil. The words caught his attention. Strange, unfamiliar, almost ancient sounding. He read testimonies from seniors like him who spoke of sharper sight, of colors returning, of putting aside their glasses for the first time in years. He read about anthocyanins, those tiny warriors hidden in the oil, fighting oxidative stress, boosting circulation in the eyes. The language was both scientific and strangely poetic, as if describing a light still burning deep within the body, waiting to be fed. Skepticism tugged at him. After all, hadn't he tried other things before? But there was something about the consistency of the stories, the way they echoed his own desperation, yet ended with hope. He remembered his father, long gone now, who used to say, "Nature gives us what time takes away, if only we listen." That thought clung to him like a lantern in the dark. When he told his wife, she looked at him with cautious concern. "Another oil?" she asked, her voice carrying both doubt and love. He nodded, quietly resolute. "Just one more try," he said. And so he ordered it, capsules that promised more than moisture, promising nourishment. When the bottle arrived, he held it in his palm like a small, fragile chance. The first weeks brought little change, at least nothing dramatic, but he stayed faithful. Each morning with his coffee, he swallowed the capsule, whispering almost like a prayer. By the second month, he noticed the letters in his newspaper no longer swam as violently. By the third, the colors in his rose garden seemed less washed out, the reds richer, the greens deeper. He caught himself one morning staring at the petals with a boyish grin, marveling that he could see the dew glistening again. But more than the small victories in clarity, there was a shift in Ulysses himself. Hope had returned, not the wild, reckless hope of youth, but the quiet, enduring hope of someone who has seen life's shadows and chooses to chase the light anyway. He was not cured, not yet, perhaps not ever fully, but he was alive in the fight, and that mattered. His wife noticed it too, the way he stood straighter, the way his laughter came easier. His granddaughter noticed as well, running into his arms and squealing, "Papa, you saw me first." And indeed, he had. This was not just about avoiding glasses, it was about reclaiming life, piece by piece, moment by moment. Ulysses had begun a journey, one that stretched far beyond the eyes themselves. He was discovering that sometimes the smallest habits, the overlooked gifts of nature, could breathe strength back into the body. And in that discovery, he found not just clearer vision, but a renewed sense of belonging in the world he loved. Ulysses had always believed in the old remedies. He came from a generation that trusted castor oil the way children trust their mothers. His father used it for sore joints, his mother for stomach upset, and when his eyes began to dry and sting in the evenings, it was castor oil he reached for without hesitation. He remembered sitting on the edge of his bed with the tiny brown bottle in his hand, unscrewing the cap and letting the thick drops fall into his palm before rubbing them gently along his eyelids. For a while, it felt soothing, as though the oil wrapped his tired eyes in a thin blanket of comfort. But the comfort was fleeting. Within an hour, his vision blurred again, not from age this time, but from the heaviness of the oil itself. His wife teased him gently, saying he looked like he'd been crying, his eyes glazed and glassy. He laughed with her because laughter was easier than admitting his growing disappointment. Still, he clung to the habit. Every night before bed, he used castor oil, convincing himself that consistency would one day yield results. Weeks passed. The newspaper remained a blur. The colors in his garden dulled further, and the strings of his granddaughter's laughter pulled farther away as though echoing down a long hallway. Ulysses began to sense a truth he didn't want to face. Castor oil wasn't enough. It might soothe, yes, but it wasn't restoring. It wasn't returning what he was losing, his clarity, his independence, his sense of control. One morning, after struggling through a crossword puzzle he used to breeze through, he set the pencil down and sighed. The paper in front of him was full of half-formed answers and guesses, the boxes mocking him with their emptiness. His wife reached across the table and touched his hand. "Maybe it's time to stop relying on old tricks," she said softly. Ulysses bristled, not at her words, but at the truth inside them. Castor oil was a comfort, but not a cure. And the more he leaned on it, the more he felt he was stalling, delaying an inevitable decline. That realization stung. For Ulysses, castor oil wasn't just oil, it was a connection to his past, to the traditions of his family, to the belief that nature's simplest gifts could solve nearly anything. To admit it wasn't working felt like betraying that legacy. But each blurry word on the page, each dimmed color in his garden, each missed sparkle in his granddaughter's eyes reminded him that nostalgia couldn't save his sight. He needed something more. The real turning point came during a visit to his doctor. He mentioned, almost casually, that he'd been using castor oil for weeks, expecting at least a nod of approval. Instead, the doctor tilted his head, gave a small sigh, and said, "It may help with dryness, Ulysses, but it won't stop the changes in your vision." Those words, spoken so plainly, cut deeper than he expected. For the first time, he saw castor oil not as a lifeline, but as a crutch, one that was keeping him from seeking something stronger, something truly transformative. That night, sitting on his porch as the sun lowered itself into a blur of orange and pink, Ulysses faced a quiet grief. He realized he'd been holding on to castor oil not because it was helping, but because it was familiar. And familiarity had given him a false sense of control. It was time, he thought, to open his hands and let go. Yet letting go meant stepping into uncertainty, searching for answers he didn't know existed. He wasn't sure if he had the strength for that, but his granddaughter gave him the strength. The next weekend, she ran into the yard with a book in her hand, one she wanted him to read aloud. He took it, squinted, and stumbled through the words, his voice halting where once it had flowed with ease. She frowned, confused, not yet old enough to understand what age could steal. Ulysses closed the book and kissed her forehead, but inside he felt hollow. Castor oil could not give him back the gift of reading to her. That was the moment he decided, truly decided, that he needed to search beyond the familiar. In the days that followed, he didn't discard the castor oil entirely. It still sat on the nightstand, a reminder of both comfort and limitation. But he began to look beyond it, to ask questions he hadn't dared before. He found himself drawn to late-night searches on the computer, chasing rumors of other oils, other remedies, stories whispered in corners of the internet where seniors like him shared their journeys. Each post was like a lighthouse in fog, faint but guiding him toward possibilities he had never considered. Castor oil had been his first step, his safety net, but now it was also his teacher. It taught him that not everything handed down through generations was enough on its own. Sometimes the body needed more than moisture. It needed nourishment, circulation, renewal. Ulysses didn't yet know what form that would take, but he knew one thing: he could no longer settle for blurred mornings and hollow evenings. The truth about castor oil wasn't just that it had limits. It was that holding on to it too tightly kept him from discovering the deeper healing he craved. As he lay in bed that night, the brown bottle still within reach, he closed his eyes and let the thought sink in. Tomorrow would not be about clinging to what once worked. Tomorrow would be about seeking what could still bring him back to life. And though he didn't know it yet, tomorrow would be the first step toward bilberry seed oil, toward colors returning, words steadying, and hope rekindling in ways he hadn't imagined possible. Ulysses never thought much about statistics. Numbers were for accountants, not for men who spent their lives working with their hands, fixing broken fences, planting rows of beans, building a life piece by piece. But one evening, while browsing online in search of answers, he stumbled across a report from the American Optometric Association. The words were stark. Over 72% of adults over 60 experience progressive vision loss. He sat back in his chair, letting the figure settle like dust in a still room. 72%, nearly 3 out of every 4 people his age. He thought of his neighbors, of his church friends, of the men who sat around the diner's corner booth, swapping stories of better days. How many of them had already surrendered to glasses, to thicker lenses, to magnifiers perched like small crutches on their noses? How many had stopped driving at night, claiming they preferred the daylight, but secretly terrified of the blurred glare of headlights? Suddenly, his struggle no longer felt like a private battle. It was part of a larger story, one written into the bodies of almost everyone he knew. The thought was oddly both comforting and frightening. Comforting because he wasn't alone. Frightening because it meant the odds were against him. Age was not a thief that singled him out. It was a wave sweeping across his whole generation. He imagined the wave rolling through retirement homes, through quiet suburban streets, through the faces of grandmothers and grandfathers bending over their family photographs only to squint, unsure of the details. He wondered if his granddaughter would remember him as a man who could see her clearly, or as one who peered through the fog, always just a little out of focus. It was during a Sunday lunch that the reality struck closer to home. His friend Harold, 71, complained that he could no longer thread a fishing line. Another neighbor, Ruth, admitted she had stopped baking pies because she couldn't read the recipes in her faded cookbooks. One by one, their stories piled up, each like a stone dropped into the well of his mind. This was what aging meant, people said with resignation. This was normal, but Ulysses refused to let normal mean inevitable. That night, he spoke to his wife about it. She listened, her hands folded gently on her lap, her eyes reflecting both worry and steadiness. "Ulysses," she said, "maybe this is just how life goes. Maybe we learn to accept what fades." But Ulysses shook his head. Acceptance felt like surrender, and surrender felt like closing his eyes while still alive. He wanted more than to fade quietly into blurred lines and dim colors. He wanted to keep living in the full vibrancy of the world, to see his roses, his books, his granddaughter's smile, not as ghosts, but as truths. He began to pay closer attention to his body, to the little signs he had ignored before. The strain in his temples after an afternoon of reading, the dryness in his eyes after mowing the lawn, the way headlights at dusk fractured into starbursts, dazzling and disorienting. Each symptom was like a whisper, reminding him that vision loss wasn't a sudden collapse, but a slow unraveling. And with each whisper came a choice: ignore it and accept the unraveling, or listen and fight back. At his next checkup, Ulysses asked his doctor why so many people his age were losing their sight. The doctor spoke kindly, explaining about weakened blood vessels, oxidative stress, the way the eyes simply wore down like any other part of the body. But what lingered in Ulysses's mind wasn't the science. It was the phrase the doctor used. The eyes age just like the rest of us. It struck him as unfair, almost cruel, that the very windows through which he had seen the world for nearly 7 decades would dim without his permission. On his way home, he noticed things he hadn't before. An elderly woman stepping off the bus, holding her grandson's hand and leaning in close as though needing him to describe what she couldn't see. An older man in the grocery store squinting at labels, moving jars of sauce closer and farther in search of clarity. These small moments revealed a truth too large to ignore. Vision loss was not just his story, but the quiet story of nearly everyone around him. And yet, Ulysses also realized something else. If so many were losing their sight, then perhaps the answer wasn't just in stronger glasses or thicker lenses. Perhaps the answer lay in finding what the majority had overlooked. He thought again of that article he had read about bilberry seed oil, tucked among the noise of countless remedies and advertisements. Could it be that while everyone else resigned themselves to fading vision, a few had stumbled onto a different path, one where sight could be nurtured rather than surrendered? That night, as the clock ticked softly in the quiet house, Ulysses sat once more at his computer. He wasn't looking for numbers anymore, he was looking for stories. He wanted to know if others had refused to accept the statistics, if they had found ways to push back against the tide of vision loss. He read accounts from strangers scattered across the world, seniors like him who described their surprise at seeing colors brighten, letters sharpen, lives expand again after introducing one small habit. Their words lit something in him, like sparks landing on kindling. The statistic said 72%. But Ulysses didn't want to be part of that number. He wanted to be part of the exception, the ones who fought back, who reclaimed what age tried to take. For the first time in months, he felt the weight of inevitability lift. There was another road, faint but visible, and he intended to follow it. And so, with quiet determination, Ulysses leaned forward in his chair, scrolling deeper into the world of possibilities. Castor oil had been his beginning, but bilberry seed oil was becoming his hope. The wave of vision loss might sweep across his generation, but Ulysses was ready to stand against it, even if he stood alone. Ulysses had never thought of himself as a man who questioned doctors. He grew up in a time when a white coat carried authority, when prescriptions were followed without a second guess, and when you didn't argue with the people who knew more than you. But something had shifted in him after his last visit. The doctor's words, "It's common, just stronger lenses," felt too final, too resigned. And for the first time, Ulysses wondered if there were truths the professionals weren't saying out loud. That curiosity sent him back to his late-night habit of searching, the glow of the computer screen painting his weathered face in pale blue. He typed in phrases he had never dared before: vision loss alternatives, natural remedies for eyes, hidden reports on eyesight after 60. And there, buried beneath pages of generic advice, he stumbled on a summary of a study published in Europe. It wasn't plastered across health magazines or promoted in clinics. It was tucked away, almost hidden, like a secret meant only for those desperate enough to dig for it. The study spoke of anthocyanins, deep pigments found in certain plants with the power to strengthen blood flow to the retina. It wasn't a miracle cure, not a flashy advertisement, but something quieter. Scientists documenting real changes in people's vision after weeks of consistent use. Ulysses leaned closer, reading how participants not only slowed their vision decline, but in some cases actually reported improvements. He sat back, stunned. Why hadn't his doctor mentioned this? Why were glasses handed out so freely, yet this possibility never brought up? The thought made him restless. That weekend at church, he asked Harold if his doctor had ever mentioned anything beyond glasses. Harold shook his head, chuckling bitterly. Doctors don't make money telling you to eat berries or take oils. They make money selling you lenses. Ulysses didn't like to think so cynically, but the seed of doubt had been planted. Maybe the silence wasn't malice, but neglect. Either way, it meant people like him were left fumbling in the dark. That night, he printed out the study, its words stark on white paper. His wife found him at the kitchen table, glasses perched low on his nose as he highlighted passages with the same care he once gave to fixing his tools. She asked him what he was doing. He looked up, his voice tinged with both frustration and excitement. "They don't tell us everything, Mary. They don't tell us there might be ways to nourish the eyes instead of just covering the problem with lenses." She frowned gently, unsure whether to believe or to protect him from disappointment. But she didn't stop him. She knew that fire in his eyes meant he was alive in the search again. The more he read, the more pieces began to connect. He learned that the eye was not just a passive organ, but a living part of him, hungry for oxygen, for nutrients, for circulation. He learned that antioxidants like anthocyanins fought back against something called oxidative stress, tiny invaders that aged the cells faster than time alone. It was not about turning back the clock, but about giving the clock less power to wear him down. These weren't ideas from folk tales, they were backed by researchers with data, graphs, measurable change. And yet none of this had been spoken in his doctor's office. Ulysses felt betrayed, but also strangely empowered. If the information wasn't being handed to him, then he would take it for himself. He realized that sometimes doctors focused on what was predictable, what could be controlled with prescriptions and lenses. But real healing often required stepping into the unknown, trusting in things not yet mainstream, not yet profitable, but deeply human. One evening, while reading the study aloud to his wife, he stopped mid-sentence and laughed softly. "Can you imagine," he said, "if people our age knew this, if they knew there was more to eye health than stronger lenses and brighter lamps? How different would our lives look?" Mary smiled, squeezing his hand. "Maybe you should be the one to tell them," she whispered. Ulysses didn't answer, but inside he felt the weight of her words. Perhaps this wasn't just about his eyes anymore. Perhaps it was about being a messenger for others caught in the same dimming world. The next morning, as sunlight streamed through the curtains, Ulysses noticed something he hadn't in years. The fine lines of light on the wooden table, the way the shadows stretched gently across its surface. It wasn't that his vision had suddenly sharpened, it was that his attention had. He began to see the world differently, with the awareness that maybe decline was not destiny. He thought again of the report, the hidden knowledge tucked away in journals while millions of seniors resigned themselves to glasses. The contrast infuriated him, but it also fueled him. That afternoon, he went to the library, asking the librarian to help him find more journals, more studies. She raised an eyebrow, surprised at his request, but guided him kindly. He sat for hours, poring over medical articles that felt both foreign and familiar, like puzzle pieces scattered across a table. Every paragraph he read added another layer of conviction. There was truth here, hidden but waiting, and it could change lives. By the time he left, night had fallen and the library's doors closed softly behind him. The cool air hit his face and he breathed deeply. He knew now that the story doctors gave, the story of inevitable decline, was only part of the truth. The rest lay hidden in reports few would ever see, but he had found them. And that meant hope was not a myth. Hope was written in ink, recorded by scientists, waiting for those willing to search. Ulysses walked home under the streetlights, the world still a little blurred, but his spirit sharper than it had been in years. For the first time since the doctor had told him his eyesight would only worsen, he believed otherwise. The hidden report wasn't just information, it was a key, unlocking a door he thought had been closed forever. Ulysses never believed in miracles, not the kind you read about in glossy advertisements or overheard in casual gossip. He had lived long enough to know that real change rarely came in sudden flashes. Instead, it came like the slow growth of a tree, rooted in small, steady habits, invisible at first, but undeniable over time. So when he read that line in one of the hidden reports, "A single daily habit may prevent seniors from needing glasses at all," he paused, skeptical but curious. Could something so simple really alter the course of his failing sight? He thought back to all the habits that had shaped his life. Waking at dawn to tend the garden, saying grace before meals, walking the same worn path through the neighborhood each evening. These weren't extraordinary acts, but they had carved his days into meaning, brick by brick. Maybe, he wondered, his eyes needed the same kind of steady devotion. Not a desperate, one-time cure, but a rhythm, a daily act of care that would, over weeks and months, change the story unfolding inside his body. The habit he stumbled upon was simple, a capsule of bilberry seed oil every morning with breakfast. He remembered holding the bottle in his hand the first time it arrived, the label unassuming, the capsule small and pale. Nothing about it screamed miracle, yet he felt a twinge of hope, the kind that whispered rather than shouted. He placed the bottle on the kitchen counter right beside the coffee pot. That way it would meet him every morning, a quiet reminder that change begins not with grandeur, but with consistency. The first morning he took it, he almost laughed at how ordinary the act was. A swallow of water, a small capsule sliding down his throat. No fanfare, no fireworks. His wife raised an eyebrow when she saw him, asking if he truly believed it would work. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I know this. I have to try." There was honesty in his voice, the kind born not of certainty but of determination. He wasn't chasing instant results. He was planting a seed. Days passed and he kept at it, each morning capsule with coffee. Each evening he noted in his mind whether anything had changed. The first week brought nothing remarkable, but he didn't falter. He remembered how his garden grew, weeks of watering barren soil before the first sprout broke through. Why should his body be any different? Change, he believed, would come quietly in its own time. By the third week, something shifted. It was subtle, almost easy to dismiss. He was reading the morning paper when he realized he hadn't squinted as hard at the headlines. He blinked, thinking it was a trick of the light, but the words seemed steadier, less slippery on the page. He didn't announce it to his wife, didn't want to speak too soon, but inside a spark flared. Was it beginning? The habit soon became ritual. He came to love the sound of the capsule bottle tapping lightly on the counter, the cool sip of water afterward, the steady reassurance that he was doing something for himself. It wasn't just about his eyes anymore. It was about agency, about refusing to surrender to the slow fade of age. Each swallow felt like a small act of rebellion against inevitability, a promise to his future self that he was still in the fight. His wife noticed the difference before he confessed it. One evening, as he read aloud to his granddaughter, the words flowed smoother, less broken by pauses and guesses. When he finished, the little girl clapped, delighted, and Mary leaned back in her chair, watching him with a soft smile. Later that night, she touched his hand and said, "You didn't stumble once tonight. Do you realize that?" Ulysses chuckled, shaking his head, but in truth, his heart swelled. That moment alone was worth every capsule. He thought often about how easy it would have been to ignore the habit, how many seniors gave up before they even tried, convinced nothing simple could possibly matter. But Ulysses knew better now. Life was never built on grand gestures. It was built on the small, repeated choices no one applauded. A capsule in the morning, a step taken even when tired, a refusal to give up when surrender would be simpler. That was where transformation lived. By the 6th week, he no longer doubted. The improvement was undeniable. The colors in his rose garden seemed brighter, the words in his books sharper, the glare of headlights less blinding. Not perfect, never perfect, but better, tangibly better. And it all traced back to that one small act he repeated every day. He thought of it like drops of water on stone. One drop meant nothing, but thousands reshaped the rock. One evening, as he sat on the porch watching the sun sink behind the trees, he whispered to himself, "So this is what they meant." He realized then that the reports he had uncovered weren't about miracles at all. They were about habits, about the stubborn persistence of showing up for yourself, day after day, capsule after capsule, until the body began to listen. That was the hidden truth doctors rarely shared. Healing often came not in sweeping cures, but in the steady faithfulness of daily choices. Ulysses looked down at his hands, calloused from years of work, and smiled. He knew he would never stop taking that capsule, not because it was magic, but because it reminded him of something deeper, that his life was still his to shape. Each morning he chose clarity over decline. Each morning he claimed a piece of his sight back. And in that choice, repeated endlessly, everything began to change. Ulysses remembered the first time he heard the words bilberry seed oil. They had seemed odd, almost foreign, like something whispered in an apothecary centuries ago. He had known of castor oil his whole life, his mother's remedy for nearly everything, his neighbor's trusted cure for eye strain. But bilberry seed oil, that was new, strange. And yet it kept appearing in the hidden corners of the studies he read, slipping into testimonies from people his age who swore by it. The more he saw the name, the more it tugged at him, until finally, curiosity outweighed his skepticism. The story of castor oil and bilberry seed oil played in his mind like a quiet rivalry. Castor oil had been the old soldier, reliable, comforting, but limited. It soothed the dryness, gave temporary ease, but could not fight deeper battles. Bilberry seed oil, on the other hand, was spoken of as something sharper, more alive. People described it as not just moisturizing the eyes, but feeding them, sending strength where weakness was setting in, giving the retina the circulation it craved. It was like comparing a bandage to nourishment. One covered the wound, the other healed it from within. When Ulysses finally ordered his first bottle, he held it in his hand as if weighing more than capsules. He was weighing belief against doubt, hope against resignation. The packaging was plain, nothing like the polished advertisements for multivitamins he saw in magazines. And yet, perhaps because of its simplicity, it felt honest. He twisted the cap, listened to the faint rattle of capsules inside, and told himself, "This is not another trick. This is another chance." His wife watched as he began. She teased him lightly. "Another oil, Ulysses? You'll be a walking pharmacy before long." But behind the teasing was a trace of worry. She had seen him disappointed before, after castor oil failed to deliver. He met her gaze and said softly, "This one is different. It's not about coating the eye. It's about feeding it." She said nothing more, but he noticed her glancing at him more often in the following weeks, as if waiting to see whether his hope would hold or collapse again. The first thing he noticed about bilberry seed oil was how effortless it became part of his life. Unlike castor oil, with its messy drops and glassy residue, this was simple. A capsule in the morning, a sip of water, done. He liked the ritual, the clean decisiveness of it. No fumbling at night with stinging eyes, just a quiet act of faith at the start of each day. He began to call it his morning armor, a shield he put on against the slow theft of time. Weeks turned into months, and the difference grew clearer. With castor oil, the relief was temporary and surface deep. With bilberry seed oil, the changes were subtle but cumulative, as if his eyes were being rebuilt cell by cell. He noticed colors seemed richer, the glare of car headlights less hostile, the newspaper less daunting. The first time he read his granddaughter's bedtime story without stumbling, he almost cried. It wasn't perfect vision, he still needed help for fine print, but it was unmistakably better, and better was everything. One afternoon, his neighbor Ruth came by, complaining about her worsening eyesight. She mentioned castor oil, how it no longer worked as it once had. Ulysses listened quietly, then shared his own journey. He told her about bilberry seed oil, not as a salesman, but as a man who had walked in her shoes. "Castor oil soothes," he said gently, "but bilberry seed oil strengthens. It's like the difference between resting tired muscles and rebuilding them." Ruth looked at him skeptically at first, but he could see the flicker of hope in her eyes, the same flicker that had once lit his. For Ulysses, the discovery wasn't just about clearer sight, it was about shifting from resignation to resilience. Castor oil represented the acceptance of decline, comfort for the inevitable. Bilberry seed oil represented the possibility of resistance, nourishment for renewal. Every morning, Capsule reminded him that his story wasn't finished, that age didn't have the final word. He thought often of how many seniors clung to castor oil because it was familiar, passed down through generations, whispered as wisdom. And yet, here was this new oil quietly outshining the old, not with bold promises, but with steady evidence, with results people could feel. He wanted to shout it from the rooftops, but instead he shared it gently, like passing along a secret, too precious to be shouted into the wind. One evening, sitting with his wife on the porch, he confessed, "I think this oil saved more than my eyes. It saved my hope." She looked at him, and for the first time in a long time, he saw pride rather than concern in her expression. "Maybe it's not the oil alone," she said softly. "Maybe it's that you chose to believe again." He nodded, knowing she was right. The capsules nourished his eyes, but the choice to take them nourished his spirit. And so castor oil became a memory, a kind old friend who did what it could but could go no further. Bilberry seed oil became the new companion, steady, quiet, and faithful. It wasn't a miracle. It was better than that. It was proof that even in the later chapters of life, new discoveries could still change the story. Ulysses had always thought of his eyes as fragile windows, glass panes that allowed him to see the world but grew cloudier with age. He never imagined they were alive, hungry, pulsing with need. That changed one evening as he sat with a cup of tea, reading more about bilberry seed oil. The words leapt off the page. "It nourishes the retina by improving blood flow and protecting delicate cells." For the first time, he pictured his eyes not as failing windows, but as living gardens, thirsty for care. He remembered tending his roses. When he watered them regularly, they bloomed vibrant, petals rich and soft. When he neglected them, they withered, leaves curling at the edges, colors fading to brown. The difference was never immediate. It took weeks for the signs to appear. And it was the same, he realized, with his eyes. They hadn't failed overnight. They had been starving slowly, deprived of the nutrients and circulation they needed. Now, with each capsule, he was watering them again, feeding life where decline had settled. The science fascinated him, but more than that, it comforted him. Words like anthocyanins and antioxidants no longer sounded distant and clinical. They felt like allies, tiny guardians entering his bloodstream, seeking out the fragile vessels of his retina, strengthening them from the inside. He imagined them like small lanterns, lighting pathways where darkness threatened. The thought made him smile. For once, he felt his body wasn't betraying him, it was being rebuilt, gently, steadily, with every swallow. Weeks later, Ulysses noticed something that nearly brought tears to his eyes. He was sitting at the kitchen table, the newspaper spread before him, when he realized he had been reading for 20 minutes without once rubbing his eyes or pushing the paper away. He leaned back, stunned. It wasn't that his vision was perfect, but it was steady, less of a battle, more of a gift. His wife noticed too. "You look different," she said, watching him, "like you're not straining anymore." He nodded slowly, his throat tight with unspoken gratitude. One afternoon, during his granddaughter's visit, he told her a story about how the eyes worked, weaving the science he had learned into a tale. He explained how tiny streams of blood carried oxygen to the retina, how the cells lit up when they were fed, how without that nourishment the world dimmed. She listened wide-eyed, as if he were telling her a fairy tale. "So the oil is like food for your eyes?" she asked. Ulysses chuckled softly. "Exactly," he said. "Food for the part of me that sees you." The more he understood, the more reverence he felt for the small capsules lying neatly on his counter. They were not just supplements, they were bridges, carrying him back to the clarity he thought was gone. Each morning when he swallowed one, he imagined it traveling into his veins, making its way to the fragile back of his eyes, nourishing the parts of him that connected sight to memory, light to meaning. It made the act sacred, almost like prayer. But there were still moments of doubt. Some evenings his eyes grew tired, blurring as the day wore on. In those moments, he wondered if he was fooling himself. Yet each time, the progress returned in quiet, undeniable ways. Colors sharper, letters steadier, faces clearer. He realized then that healing was not a straight road, but a winding path, with steps forward and backward. What mattered was not perfection, but direction, and his direction was toward light. One night, while lying in bed, he whispered to his wife, "It feels like my eyes are waking up." She turned to him, her face soft in the lamplight. "Maybe they're remembering what it's like to be cared for," she said. Her words struck him deeply. For years, he had treated his eyes like passive tools, expecting them to serve him endlessly. Now, for the first time, he was serving them. That shift changed everything, not just how he saw, but how he lived. Ulysses began to notice beauty in small things again. The glimmer of dew on the morning grass, the faint veins on a maple leaf, the sparkle in his granddaughter's brown eyes when she laughed. Each detail was a reminder that life was richer when fully seen, and each detail reminded him why he continued his daily ritual. It was not about chasing youth, it was about honoring the life he still had with eyes wide open to receive it. He thought back to his doctor's words, "The eyes age just like the rest of us." Ulysses no longer heard that as a sentence. He heard it as a challenge. Yes, eyes aged, but they could also be nourished, strengthened, reminded of their vitality. Bilberry seed oil had shown him that. It had shifted his understanding from helpless decline to active care. His eyes were not fading windows after all. They were living gardens, and he had finally remembered to tend them. And as he drifted to sleep, the capsule already at work deep inside him, he felt something he hadn't in a long time. He felt safe, not because his eyesight was perfect, but because he had found a way to meet the decline with love, patience, and renewal. And that, he thought, was a vision worth holding on to. The first time Ulysses said the word anthocyanins aloud, he chuckled at himself. It felt strange in his mouth, a word too long, too scientific for an old man who preferred plain talk. Yet the more he learned about them, the more reverence he felt for the tiny pigments that seemed to be working wonders inside him. They were hidden in the deep colors of fruits and berries, painting the world in shades of purple, blue, and red, and now they were painting hope across his life. He remembered reading that anthocyanins were the reason bilberry seed oil worked so differently from castor oil. Castor soothed, bilberry nourished, and the secret lay in these pigments, guardians that strengthened blood vessels, improved circulation, and shielded cells from the wear of time. Ulysses imagined them like small soldiers marching through his veins with lanterns in their hands, lighting up the dark corners where age had cast its shadows. It gave him comfort to think that while he went about his day, unseen armies were fighting quietly on his behalf. One evening, his granddaughter brought him a small bowl of blueberries. "They're good for your eyes," she said, repeating what her mother had told her. Ulysses smiled, thinking of the anthocyanins hidden inside each berry, tiny treasures disguised as food. He popped one into his mouth and felt a rush of gratitude, not just for the sweetness, but for the reminder that nature often held answers in plain sight. "You're right," he told her. "These little ones carry secrets older than both of us." She giggled, not fully understanding, but delighted to be part of his secret world. The more he embraced anthocyanins, the more he began to notice their colors everywhere. The violet blooms in his garden, the red of ripe cherries, the dusky purple of grapes at the market. Each one felt like a message, whispering, "We are here for you. We have always been here." It changed how he saw food, turning meals into small acts of medicine. His morning oatmeal, once plain and gray, now gleamed with blueberries. His afternoon snacks shifted from crackers to a handful of blackberries. Even a glass of water felt richer when he dropped in a slice of dark plum. Mary, his wife, teased him for fussing over colors. "Since when do you care what shade your food is?" she asked with a laugh, but then she watched him eat, watched his eyes soften with appreciation, and something in her shifted too. She began adding spinach to their soups, sprinkling red cabbage into their salads, tossing raspberries onto their plates. "If pigments are what you need," she said one evening, "then let's fill this house with color." Together, they began to eat with new intention, as if every meal was a canvas for anthocyanins. What struck Ulysses most was how natural it felt. This wasn't about swallowing chemicals or forcing treatments. It was about returning to the richness of what nature had always offered. For years, he had overlooked these simple gifts, distracted by convenience foods and rushed meals. But now, every bite carried meaning. Every berry was a quiet affirmation. Your body still knows how to heal. And the effects? They weren't only in his eyes. He noticed his energy returning, his steps lighter on the porch stairs, his thoughts clearer when he read in the evenings. It was as if the anthocyanins were not just feeding his eyes, but flowing through his whole being, brushing away cobwebs he hadn't even realized were there. He began to wonder if perhaps these pigments didn't only guard vision, they guarded vitality itself. One afternoon, while visiting his doctor, Ulysses brought up what he had learned. "Have you ever told patients about anthocyanins?" he asked. The doctor hesitated, then admitted, "They're beneficial, yes, but most people won't change their habits. It's easier to hand them glasses than convince them to change their diet." Ulysses left the office with mixed feelings. On one hand, he was frustrated that something so simple was rarely encouraged. On the other, he felt proud that he had chosen differently, that he had taken ownership of his own health. At home, he wrote a note to himself and pinned it to the refrigerator. "Consistency is power." Every morning capsule of bilberry seed oil, every handful of berries, every plate of dark greens, these weren't small acts. They were bricks in the foundation of his recovery. Anthocyanins were not magic, but they were faithful. And faithfulness, he knew, could outlast even time. There were days when progress felt slow, when his eyes still tired by evening, when the world blurred despite his efforts. On those days, he reminded himself that gardens didn't bloom overnight. The soldiers of anthocyanins were still at work, unseen but unwavering, and each day he chose to feed them, to give them what they needed to fight for him. That choice was as important as the outcome. One night, as he tucked his granddaughter into bed, she asked him, "Papa, do you think your eyes will see me forever?" The question caught him off guard, tender and piercing. He kissed her forehead and whispered, "I think as long as I keep giving them what they need, they'll see you for as long as I'm here." And in that moment, he realized that anthocyanins weren't just about vision. They were about love, about making sure he could see the faces he cherished, the life he had built, the beauty still unfolding around him. And so anthocyanins became more than a word, more than a pigment. They became a promise. A reminder that hidden in the deep colors of nature were quiet powers waiting for those willing to seek them. For Ulysses, they were no longer strange syllables he stumbled over. They were companions, steadfast and true, carrying light into the places age had dimmed. Ulysses had always thought of eyesight as something simple. Light goes in, the eyes adjust, and the world appears. He never considered what fueled those eyes, what kept them alive and sharp. But the more he read, the clearer it became. Vision wasn't just about the eyes themselves. It was about the blood that nourished them, the streams of life carrying oxygen and nutrients to the delicate tissue of the retina. He pictured the retina like the soil in his garden. No matter how carefully he planted, no matter how rich the seeds, nothing would grow if the soil was dry and starved of water. The same was true of his eyes. Without healthy blood flow, without that constant bathing of oxygen and fuel, the cells of his retina would wither, leaving him with shadows where once there had been light. The first time this truth sank in, Ulysses felt a pang of regret. He thought of his younger years, when he smoked cigars with his friends on summer evenings, when he salted his food too heavily, when he stayed up late and ignored the way his eyes stung in protest. He realized he had never thought of circulation as something to protect, only as something that just happened. But age had taught him differently. Blood flow weakened with time, vessels stiffened, and the eyes, hungry, fragile, were left gasping. Bilberry seed oil, he discovered, wasn't just about anthocyanins fighting oxidative stress. It was also about circulation. The oil's compounds strengthened the tiny capillaries in his eyes, making them more flexible, more capable of carrying what was needed to keep his vision alive. Reading that felt like unlocking a door. He wasn't helpless against the fog. He could do something to keep the streams flowing. He noticed the difference most when driving at dusk. Before, headlights fractured into bright starbursts, scattering across his vision like shards of glass. Now, though not perfect, they seemed sharper, less painful. It was as if his eyes were clearing the pathways, blood flowing more freely, light being processed with greater ease. He found himself relaxing into the drive, his grip on the wheel loosening, his heart calming. The road no longer felt like an enemy. Mary noticed too. One evening she said, "You're not squinting at the television anymore." Ulysses hadn't realized, but she was right. Shows he once abandoned because of the blur were now enjoyable again. He felt a small surge of pride, not in himself alone, but in the quiet work happening inside his body. He imagined the capillaries in his eyes, fed by the oil, strengthened like streams after a rainstorm. But the realization about blood flow didn't stop with his eyes. He began to notice how circulation tied everything together, his heart, his brain, even the energy in his steps. On days when he walked briskly around the block, his eyes felt clearer afterward, as though the movement pushed life through every vessel. On days when he sat too long, staring at the television, his vision seemed heavier, cloudier. It was all connected. The eyes were not islands, they were part of a great river system, and the river had to keep moving. He thought often of his father, who had suffered from strokes late in life. At the time, Ulysses had only seen the tragedy of it, the slurred speech, the weakened body. Now he realized it had all been about circulation, blood failing to flow where it needed. And he wondered if perhaps he had inherited that same fragility, a family thread of weakened vessels. But instead of fear, he felt determination. If circulation was the key, then he would do everything in his power to keep it flowing. That meant more than capsules. It meant walking each day, even when his joints complained. It meant cutting back on the heavy, salted meats he once craved. It meant drinking water faithfully, not just coffee. And every choice he made, he pictured it as feeding the river, keeping the streams alive. His eyes were part of that river, and he owed them more than neglect. One morning, as he sipped his coffee with his capsule, he looked out at the sunrise. The sky was painted in pinks and golds, colors he feared he had lost forever. For a moment, he felt tears sting, not from blur, but from gratitude. He could see it, truly see it. The blood was flowing, the colors were returning, and life itself seemed brighter. Later, when he told Harold about the changes, his friend shook his head skeptically. Blood flow? Sounds too simple. Ulysses just smiled. Sometimes the simplest truths are the ones we ignore, but they're the ones that save us. He didn't press the point further. He knew that each man had to come to his own realization. For Ulysses, the realization had already changed everything. As days turned into weeks, he carried this truth like a lantern. The eyes live when the blood flows. Each step he took on his walks, each berry he ate, each capsule he swallowed was not just an act of habit, but an act of devotion to that flow. He could not control everything age brought him, but he could honor the rivers inside him, keep them moving, keep them alive. And with that honor came peace. Peace that his vision was not merely slipping away. Peace that he had found a way to push back against the tide. Ulysses no longer thought of his eyes as fragile windows, but as living rivers, fed, flowing, resilient. And he vowed never again to let them run dry. The word cataract had always unsettled Ulysses. He remembered when his neighbor, Mrs. Albright, went in for surgery years ago. She had described it to the church group afterward, how the world had turned cloudy as if she were peering through frosted glass until doctors replaced the lens in her eye. She laughed it off, saying she felt 10 years younger after the operation, but Ulysses never forgot the fear in her voice before it all. He could still picture her sitting on her porch, squinting into the distance, waiting for the day her vision would be taken entirely if she didn't act. As for macular degeneration, that was a term he hadn't even heard until his own doctor mentioned it during a routine visit. "It's common after 60, the man had said, flipping through charts with little ceremony. The center of the retina weakens and people lose the sharpness of their sight." Ulysses had nodded politely, but inside the words lodged like splinters. The center of the retina, the very core of his ability to see faces, to read words, to notice details, weakening. It felt like an invisible thief waiting for its chance. So when Ulysses began taking bilberry seed oil and reading more about anthocyanins, what caught his attention most was the evidence around these two silent threats: cataracts and macular degeneration. The studies didn't promise miracles, but they offered something almost as powerful: protection. Not reversal, not fantasy, but a shield. And to a man who had felt exposed for months, a shield was enough to breathe again. He began to notice how his fear of those words had shaped his days. He had stopped reading in dim light, worried he was straining too hard. He had stopped driving at night, worried the blur of headlights meant something irreversible had begun. Each choice had been a concession, a shrinking of his life in anticipation of loss. But with every capsule of bilberry oil he took, with every berry he added to his meals, he felt less like a man retreating and more like a man standing guard at his own gates. One afternoon, his wife found him pruning roses in the garden, humming softly. "You seem lighter," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. He looked up, the sun glinting in his eyes, and replied, "I think I finally understand. It's not just about fixing what's broken, it's about protecting what's still mine." He gestured toward the roses. "Like these blooms, if I cover them from frost and feed them well, they last longer. Why wouldn't the same be true for my eyes?" That comparison stuck with him. He began to see cataracts and macular loss not as unavoidable dooms, but as intruders that could be delayed, perhaps even kept at bay with the right care. Bilberry seed oil became more than a supplement. It became his armor. Each morning capsule was a promise: "I will not surrender easily." Of course, there were still whispers of doubt. At the diner one morning, Harold scoffed when Ulysses mentioned it. "You think a berry oil is going to stop cataracts? That's wishful thinking." Ulysses didn't argue. He knew Harold wasn't ready to believe. But later, as Ulysses watched Harold struggle to read the menu, holding it closer and closer to his face, he felt a pang of sadness. Maybe Harold would change one day, maybe not. For Ulysses, the choice had already been made. The real test came months later during a checkup. The optometrist peered into his eyes, clicked lenses, measured responses. When it was over, he leaned back with mild surprise. "Your vision hasn't worsened," he said. "At your age, that's unusual. In fact, it seems steadier than last time." He shrugged, offering no explanation beyond, "Sometimes these things plateau." But Ulysses knew. He knew it was the quiet work of the anthocyanins, the protection they had been building day by day. Walking out of that office, he felt taller, as if he had won a small battle in a war no one thought could be fought. That evening, he sat with his granddaughter at the table as she colored with crayons. She held up a picture of a bright yellow sun and asked if it looked right. Ulysses smiled, able to see each line, each bold stroke of color. "It looks perfect," he told her. And for the first time in months, he believed he would be able to see her pictures for years to come. The protection wasn't only for his eyes, it was for his soul. No longer did he lie awake fearing the inevitable cloud of cataracts or the creeping shadow of macular degeneration. Instead, he felt armed, he felt ready, and in that readiness came freedom. Freedom to read, to drive, to garden, to live without the constant whisper of decline. Ulysses knew he could not control everything. Age still moved forward, unrelenting, But he also knew this: he could meet it with strength. He could give his eyes the nourishment they needed, surround himself with the colors of anthocyanins, trust the capsules lined on his counter, and in doing so, he could protect not only his sight, but the life his sight allowed him to live. Ulysses had always thought of his eyes and his heart as two separate worlds. The heart was the drum in his chest, beating stubbornly through decades of work, stress, and quiet nights. The eyes were the windows that let him see the fruit of that life. But one evening, as he sat reading about circulation, a phrase struck him like a revelation. The health of your eyes depends directly on the health of your heart. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the words. It was so simple, yet he had never considered it. The same blood that carried life to his heart also flowed through the tiny vessels of his retina. If the heart struggled, the eyes starved. It was all one system, one river branching into countless streams. And suddenly, he understood why bilberry seed oil mattered so much, not just for his vision, but for the very drum that kept him alive. The realization took him back to a night years ago when he had been rushed to the hospital after a scare. His chest had tightened, his breath shallow. The doctors told him his cholesterol was high, his blood pressure creeping upward. Since then, he had been cautious, walking more, cutting back on fried foods, but the connection to his eyes had never been made clear. Now he saw it all differently. The clearer his heart's river ran, the brighter his world would remain. The next morning, he decided to change more than just his supplement routine. He laced up his old walking shoes, worn at the heels, and set out down the familiar road by his house. At first, his legs protested, stiff and sluggish, but as he found his rhythm, something shifted. His chest filled deeper, his pulse steadied, and he imagined the blood coursing not only through his heart, but rushing to feed his eyes. Each step became an offering, a gift to both vision and vitality. Mary noticed the change quickly. She watched him return from his walks with a light sheen of sweat, his eyes brighter, his posture straighter. "You look 20 years younger," she teased, handing him a glass of water. Ulysses laughed, but inside he knew it wasn't youth returning, it was life flowing again. And in that flow, he felt both calmer and sharper, as if the world itself had turned up its volume. One afternoon, while tending his roses, Ulysses caught himself marveling at the veins on the petals, thin and intricate as lace. He had never noticed them so clearly before. It wasn't just his eyes improving, it was the whole system that supported them. Bilberry seed oil, with its omega fatty acids, was strengthening his heart, reducing inflammation, making each beat more efficient. His walks were amplifying the effect, pumping fresh blood through every fragile capillary in his eyes. Together they formed a partnership, habit and movement, nourishment and flow. He told Harold about it one day at the diner. "It's funny," he said, sipping his tea. "I thought I was just helping my eyes. Turns out I'm helping my heart too. They're tied together, closer than I ever realized." Harold raised his eyebrows, unconvinced. "Sounds like one of those health fads." Ulysses just smiled. "Maybe, but when I can see my granddaughter's drawings and still walk this town without gasping, I don't much care what anyone calls it." There was something freeing about knowing his efforts weren't just for vanity, not just to avoid glasses. They were for his very life. Each morning capsule was a safeguard for his vision, yes, but also a guardrail against the heart troubles that had haunted his family. Each walk was a prayer, each berry a promise. He no longer felt like a man patching holes in a sinking boat. He felt like a man building a stronger vessel, one that could carry him further than he had dared hope. At his next checkup, the doctor looked surprised at his blood work. "Your numbers are better than last year," he remarked. "Cholesterol down, blood pressure steady. Whatever you're doing, keep it up." Ulysses nodded quietly, hiding the smile tugging at his lips. He wanted to tell the man about bilberry seed oil, about the anthocyanins and omega fatty acids, about the way he now saw health as one great river. But he kept it to himself. Some truths, he thought, were meant to be lived rather than argued. That evening, he and Mary took a slow walk together, hand in hand. The air was cool, the sun dipping low, casting golden light across the trees. Ulysses felt his pulse steady, strong, and when he looked at Mary, her face was crisp against the fading light. "It's all connected," he whispered almost to himself. She glanced at him, curious. "What is?" He smiled. "My heart and my eyes. I take care of one, I take care of the other." And as they walked home, the truth of it settled into him. For so long, he had thought of his body in pieces, each part failing in its own time. But now he saw the whole. One system, one flow, one life. Bilberry seed oil was not just outshining castor oil, it was weaving his body back together, reminding him that nothing existed in isolation. A healthy heart meant sharper eyes, and sharper eyes meant a clearer view of the life he still had left to live. Ulysses never cared much about his skin. Wrinkles came, spots appeared, and he accepted them the way he accepted gray hair and creaky knees, badges of a long life lived. But a few months into his new routine with bilberry seed oil, something unexpected happened. Mary looked at him one morning, studying his face while he buttered his toast. "You look different," she said, her eyes narrowing in that way they did when she was trying to solve a puzzle. "Not tired, softer somehow." Ulysses laughed, shaking his head. "At my age, softer usually means I'm putting on weight," but Mary shook hers. "No, it's your skin. It looks fresh, healthier." He brushed off the comment at first, but later, while shaving, he paused. The man in the mirror still bore lines, carved by years, but there was something else too. The dryness that once left his cheeks dull seemed lessened, replaced by a faint, unfamiliar glow. He leaned closer, squinting as if to catch the change in the right light. Could it really be? The truth revealed itself slowly. On cold mornings, when his skin would usually tighten and flake, it now felt supple, less parched. The brown spots that had begun to cluster along his temples seemed softer at the edges, less angry. Even his hands, rough from gardening, seemed to hold moisture longer, as if refusing to give it up to the air. He hadn't changed his soap or his lotion. The only difference was the small capsules he swallowed each morning with his coffee. As he dug deeper, the answer became clear. Bilberry seed oil wasn't only feeding his eyes, it was feeding his skin. The same antioxidants that protected his retina from oxidative stress were also shielding the cells of his skin from the daily assault of age, sun, and time. The omega fatty acids, quiet and faithful, were repairing the skin's barrier, locking in the moisture that had always seemed to slip away too quickly. Ulysses marveled at it, all those creams he'd ignored over the years, all those bottles Mary kept on her dresser. And here he was, getting results from the inside out. Mary noticed more than he did. She began telling her friends at church that Ulysses was glowing, a word that embarrassed him at first. "I'm no young man," he muttered. But secretly he liked hearing it. He liked the way she looked at him with the same spark she had when they were courting. One evening, as they prepared for bed, she touched his cheek and said softly, "It's like I'm seeing you again, not just the years." Her words sank deep, warming him more than any praise could. Even his granddaughter noticed. Climbing into his lap one afternoon, she poked at the skin on his hand and declared, "Papa, you're not scratchy anymore." He laughed, pulling her close, but inside he felt a swell of gratitude. Age had taken many things from him: speed, strength, the dark thickness of his hair, but to have something given back, even something as small as softness, felt like a gift. The change wasn't just physical, it affected how he carried himself. Ulysses had never been vain, but he began to feel more presentable, less hidden behind the veil of age. At the diner, old friends commented that he looked well-rested. At the grocery store, a clerk asked if he had been on vacation. Each remark was a reminder that his body, though weathered, was still capable of renewal. One night, while reading more about bilberry oil, he came across a study that confirmed what he was experiencing. Participants who took it daily reported increased hydration, better elasticity, even a reduction in spots and lines. He sat back in his chair, shaking his head in disbelief. What had started as a desperate attempt to save his vision was quietly reshaping his whole appearance, his confidence, his sense of self. Still, Ulysses knew it wasn't magic. He hadn't shed the years, and he didn't expect to. But what mattered was the quality of those years. The lines on his face no longer looked like signs of defeat, but like stories carried with dignity. And if bilberry seed oil could soften the edges, both literally and figuratively, then it was more than he ever hoped for. Mary teased him for fussing with the mirror more often, but she also bought him a small bottle of unscented lotion, encouraging him to mix a drop of the oil into it at night. He tried it, and to his surprise, it absorbed quickly, leaving his skin calm and smooth. "Not bad," he admitted, rubbing the back of his hand. Mary grinned. "See? You're becoming a skincare man after all." He rolled his eyes, but he couldn't deny the quiet pleasure of it. In time, Ulysses realized that the glow others noticed wasn't just from his skin, it was from the life inside him, the circulation, the nourishment, the renewed sense of hope that radiated outward. His body was no longer fading passively. It was responding, rebuilding, glowing from within. That glow was as much about spirit as it was about skin, and so what began as a battle to keep his eyes became something larger, a transformation that touched even the face he showed to the world. For Ulysses, the surprise of glowing skin was more than vanity. It was a reminder that age, though relentless, could be met with resilience, and that resilience could show itself in unexpected, beautiful ways. Ulysses had lived long enough to know that when the stomach isn't right, nothing else feels right either. He remembered nights when he'd gone to bed after a heavy meal, twisting and turning with discomfort, his eyes burning from the restless hours. Mary used to joke that he was as grumpy as a bear when his digestion failed him, and he never denied it. But what he didn't know, what shocked him later, was how deeply his gut and his eyes were connected. It started with a small observation. A few weeks into his bilberry seed oil routine, Ulysses noticed that his belly no longer felt as bloated after dinner. He wasn't rushing for antacids, and the heaviness that had plagued him seemed to soften. His mornings felt lighter, smoother. At first, he dismissed it as coincidence, but the pattern grew undeniable. His digestion was changing, and along with it, something surprising happened. His vision felt clearer on the days his stomach was calm. Curiosity pushed him back to the articles and journals he had been reading. That was when he stumbled across a phrase that felt like a key unlocking a door: the gut-eye axis. Scientists had begun writing about the way gut health influenced everything from immunity to mood and even vision. Ulysses read how the good bacteria in his intestines produced compounds that reduced inflammation throughout the body. Reduced inflammation meant healthier blood vessels, stronger circulation, and yes, even sharper eyesight. He thought of it like a chain reaction. When his gut was balanced, nutrients flowed more easily, vitamins were absorbed better, and his eyes received what they needed. When his gut was inflamed, everything suffered: the blood, the heart, the mind, the vision. Suddenly, meals were no longer just about taste or fullness, they were about feeding a system that reached as far as his eyes. Mary was the first to notice the change in his habits. He began reaching for yogurt instead of pie in the evenings, adding sauerkraut to their dinners, sprinkling berries onto his morning oats. "Since when do you care about probiotics?" she teased. He smiled, tapping the bottle of bilberry seed oil beside his plate. "Since I realized my eyes listen to my stomach," he said simply. One afternoon, while walking through the farmer's market, Ulysses marveled at the stalls with new eyes. He no longer saw only food, he saw medicine, fuel, allies for his body. The deep purple cabbages, the jars of kefir, the baskets of blueberries all seemed like pieces of the same puzzle. He filled his basket eagerly, thinking not only of taste, but of the unseen work these foods would do once inside him. The difference was not only physical, but emotional. For years, Ulysses had endured the small humiliations of age: gas, irregularity, discomfort he never spoke of but always felt. Now, as his digestion improved, he felt lighter in spirit too. He could sit through a family dinner without shifting uncomfortably, laugh with his granddaughter without the distraction of pain. And in those moments, his eyes truly did feel sharper, as if joy itself was another form of clarity. He remembered one evening clearly. He had spent the day in the garden, harvesting tomatoes and herbs, and later Mary had prepared a simple meal: grilled chicken, roasted vegetables, a bowl of yogurt with berries for dessert. It was a clean, nourishing dinner, and afterward, as he read the newspaper, he realized something startling. The words came easily, without strain, the letters crisp against the page. He blinked, testing himself, then smiled. His gut was calm, his eyes were steady. The connection felt undeniable. Still, there were moments of doubt. Was he imagining it? Was it all in his head? But the more consistent his new habits became, the stronger the pattern grew. Bad meals left him heavy, blurred. Good meals, full of fiber, color, and fermented foods, left him light and sharp. He realized then that his health was not a collection of isolated parts, but a symphony. And when the gut was in tune, the eyes joined the harmony. When he told Harold about it over coffee, his friend chuckled. "So you're telling me sauerkraut makes you see better?" Ulysses grinned. Not sauerkraut alone, but a happy stomach makes a happy body, and happy bodies see the world more clearly. Harold rolled his eyes, but Ulysses didn't mind. He knew the truth of it in his bones and in his eyes. The greatest reward came one morning when his granddaughter asked him to read aloud again. She brought a new book, colorful and bright, and climbed into his lap. As he read, the words flowed easily, without the hesitations that once embarrassed him. She listened, wide-eyed, and when he finished, she clapped her hands. "Papa, you didn't stop once," she cheered. Ulysses hugged her tightly, his heart swelling. In that moment, he knew the connection between gut and eyes wasn't just science, it was love. Because every good choice he made, every bite of yogurt, every capsule of bilberry oil, every walk around the block, it all added up to one thing: being able to see her, read to her, live with her in clarity. That night, as he lay in bed, he whispered to Mary, "It's all connected. What I eat, how I digest, it finds its way to my eyes." She turned to him, smiling softly. "And to me," she said, touching his hand, "because when you're well, I see you too." Her words sank deep, reminding him that health was never just his own. It rippled outward, touching everyone he loved. And so, Ulysses came to see digestion as more than comfort. It was a foundation, a root system feeding not only his stomach, but his sight, his heart, his joy. Good digestion meant better eyesight, and better eyesight meant more of the world to love, more of the people to hold close, more of life to truly see. For most of his life, Ulysses trusted his memory like an old, loyal friend. He could recall the smell of his childhood home, the sound of his mother calling him in from the fields, the exact pattern of bricks on the church he and Mary were married in. But as the years pressed forward, that friend began to falter. Words slipped away mid-sentence, names hovered on the edge of his tongue, and sometimes he walked into a room forgetting why he'd entered at all. He brushed it off at first, but deep down, each lapse left a cold unease. If his sight was fading, and his memory was fading too, what would remain of the life he had built? The fear became real one afternoon when his granddaughter asked him to retell a favorite story, the one about how he and Mary had met at the county fair. He began with confidence, but halfway through he stumbled. The music, the Ferris wheel, Mary's red dress, they all swirled together, details slipping like water through his hands. His granddaughter's expectant eyes only deepened the ache in his chest. Later that night, he confessed to Mary, voice low and heavy, "What if I'm losing more than my sight? What if I'm losing myself?" Mary held his hand, her eyes steady. "You are still here," she whispered, "and you're still mine." Her words gave comfort, but Ulysses could not shake the thought. Memory was not just information, it was his identity, his connection to family, his anchor to the world. If that went, what would be left? It was around this time that he read something that startled him. Bilberry seed oil, the very capsules he was taking for his vision, was also being studied for its impact on the brain. The anthocyanins, the omega fatty acids, they weren't just nourishing the eyes. They were feeding the neurons, protecting them from oxidative stress, keeping blood flowing to the brain. Some reports even suggested sharper recall, steadier focus, clearer thinking. Ulysses blinked at the words, heart quickening. Could it be that the same oil helping him see also helped him remember? At first, he didn't dare believe, but weeks passed and small signs began to emerge. He noticed he could read longer without losing focus, conversations with Mary flowed smoother, and when his granddaughter asked for the fair story again, the details came easier. He saw her delighted grin as he described the Ferris wheel's lights, the smell of popcorn in the air, the nervous way he had asked Mary to dance. This time, the story didn't falter. This time, memory was a friend again. The changes were subtle but undeniable. When he walked into a room, he remembered why. When he met old friends at the diner, their names came to him without fumbling. When he prayed at night, the words flowed, unbroken, like they used to. It wasn't perfection, some days still carried fog, but the fog was lifting more often now, and the sun broke through with clarity. Ulysses shared this with Mary, who smiled knowingly. "Maybe your brain is waking up the way your eyes did," she said. He nodded, struck by the truth of it. Just as his eyes were gardens needing nourishment, so was his mind. And bilberry seed oil, with its quiet, faithful compounds, was feeding both. One afternoon, he sat with his old photo albums, something he hadn't done in months for fear of forgetting the faces. But this time, as he turned the pages, the names and moments returned like birds to a familiar tree. There was his father in his work hat, his mother's hands kneading bread, Mary's smile on their wedding day. He whispered the names aloud, savoring each one, and felt tears blur his vision, not from sadness, but from relief. Memory was still his. The diner conversations shifted too. Harold, ever skeptical, noticed Ulysses recalling old fishing trips with remarkable clarity. "You're remembering things better than me these days," Harold muttered, half joking. Ulysses only smiled, grateful. He didn't need to convince Harold. The proof was in the way his own mind felt lighter, less burdened by the weight of forgetting. He began to see memory as another kind of vision, the ability to see backward instead of forward, to hold the past clearly while living in the present. And just as his eyesight was sharpening, so too was this inner vision. Each capsule of bilberry oil was not just defending his eyes, but also polishing the mirror of his mind. One night, his granddaughter climbed into his lap again and asked him to tell the story of the fair once more. This time, Ulysses painted it in color: the blare of the brass band, the smell of roasted peanuts, the thrill of holding Mary's hand for the first time. His granddaughter's laughter rang out, and Mary, listening from her chair, dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. For Ulysses, it was more than just storytelling, it was victory. A victory against the slow erosion of age, against the quiet theft of memory. As he lay in bed later that night, he whispered to himself, "Sharper eyes, sharper mind." And in the stillness, he realized something profound. Bilberry seed oil hadn't just given him clearer sight. It had given him back pieces of himself he thought were slipping away. His past, his love, his identity, all held steady again, bright and sharp as the stars outside his window. By the time Ulysses had been taking bilberry seed oil for several months, his own life felt like proof enough. Yet he often wondered if his experience was rare, some small stroke of fortune not shared by others. Then slowly, stories began to find their way to him, through neighbors, through online forums, through quiet conversations at church. And he realized he was part of something larger, a quiet movement of seniors rediscovering clarity. One Sunday after service, Mrs. Albright, the same woman who once spoke of her cataract surgery, approached Ulysses with a soft smile. "I hear you've been trying something new," she said, lowering her voice. Ulysses nodded, not sure what to expect. To his surprise, she leaned in and whispered, "So have I. Bilberry seed oil. My daughter ordered it for me." Her eyes, once clouded and weary, seemed brighter. "It hasn't made me 20 again," she admitted with a chuckle, "but I can read my hymn book without the magnifier now. That's something, isn't it?" Ulysses grinned, his heart swelling at the thought that he wasn't alone. At the diner, Harold finally confessed his own experiment. "I didn't want to tell you until I was sure," he muttered over coffee, "but I've been taking that oil you keep talking about. And I'll be damned, Ulysses, it works. My night driving isn't half as scary as it used to be." Ulysses clapped him on the back, laughter ringing through the booth. To hear Harold, the skeptic, admit such a thing felt like a triumph in itself. Online, the stories were endless. Seniors in their 70s and 80s wrote about how the oil had softened the glare of headlights, sharpened the words of newspapers, even let them return to hobbies long abandoned: sewing, painting, fishing. Ulysses read each account late at night, his heart stirring with recognition. These weren't miracle claims from faceless advertisements. These were voices like his own, voices tired of being told decline was inevitable, voices discovering instead that nature still held gifts worth trusting. One story struck him deeply. A man named Daniel, 73, wrote about how he had nearly given up painting landscapes. "The colors blurred together," Daniel explained, "and I felt like I was losing the very thing that gave me joy." Then, after months on bilberry seed oil, he returned to the canvas. "I cried," Daniel admitted, "when I painted the sky blue and saw that it was truly blue, not washed out. I thought I'd lost that forever." Ulysses sat back, reading the words again and again, tears gathering in his own eyes. He understood Daniel completely. Mary began noticing, too, how these stories transformed Ulysses. He was no longer a man quietly battling decline. He was part of a community, connected to unseen others by a thread of hope. "It's not just your story anymore," she told him one evening as they sat on the porch. "It's theirs too, and maybe that's why it feels so powerful." Ulysses nodded, realizing she was right. His fight for clarity was echoed in living rooms and kitchens across the country, in seniors who were choosing to believe again. One afternoon, his granddaughter asked him why he spent so much time reading stories on the computer. He pulled her onto his lap and explained, "Because it reminds me I'm not the only one. There are others like me, and together we prove that age doesn't always mean surrender." She tilted her head thoughtfully before replying, "So it's like a team for your eyes?" Ulysses chuckled, hugging her close. Yes, exactly, a team. The most touching moment came when Ruth, his neighbor, stopped by with tears in her eyes. She had been struggling with worsening vision, and months ago, Ulysses had quietly shared his discovery. Now she stood on his porch, holding a book in her hands. "I can read again," she whispered, voice breaking. "I thought I'd lost it forever, but I can read again." Ulysses embraced her, overwhelmed. For a man who once feared being trapped in blur and shadow, to see someone else reclaim the gift of words felt like a miracle multiplied. As the weeks passed, these stories wove themselves into Ulysses' days. He no longer saw himself as a lone fighter against age. He was part of a chorus, each voice singing of resilience, each pair of eyes finding new light. The power wasn't just in the oil itself, it was in the shared hope, the collective refusal to accept decline as destiny. Ulysses often thought back to the doctor's office, to the resigned words about stronger lenses. If only the doctor could see what he now saw, the seniors reading hymn books again, the painters mixing colors again, the grandparents driving at night without fear. These weren't small victories, they were lives returned, joys reclaimed, connections made whole again. One evening, as the sun set in streaks of gold and rose, Ulysses sat on his porch and thought of all the faces he'd read about, all the lives being stitched back together with each capsule. He whispered a quiet prayer of thanks, not just for his own eyes, but for the countless others walking the same path. And in that moment, he realized that the true miracle wasn't in the oil alone. It was in the way stories could carry strength across miles, binding strangers into family. For Ulysses, that was the real gift of bilberry seed oil, not just sharper vision, but shared vision of a world where seniors could still see clearly, live fully, and believe together that even in the later chapters, there was light yet to come. Ulysses never thought of life in weeks. For him, time was measured in seasons, the planting, the blooming, the harvest, the rest. But when he began to notice how his eyesight shifted in rhythm with his new routine, he realized that weeks could carry their own kind of transformation. 6 weeks, that was all it took for him to look back and see just how far he had come. The first week had been filled with doubt. Each morning, he swallowed a capsule of bilberry seed oil, more out of stubbornness than faith. He told himself it was just another trial, like castor oil had been, something to soothe his hope, if not his eyes. Yet already, something was different. He wasn't just waiting, he was choosing. Each capsule was a statement that he hadn't given up, that he still believed in the possibility of clarity. By the second week, he began to notice subtle changes. The sting in his eyes at night was less sharp, the heaviness in the morning less cruel. He told Mary cautiously, not wanting to raise false hope. She nodded, watching him closely, her quiet support as steady as the sun. "Small steps," she reminded him, and he nodded, holding on to the thought that even small steps could still move him forward. The third week was when the turning point came. Ulysses was reading the newspaper when he suddenly realized he had gone 3 full paragraphs without squinting. The words sat steady on the page, black and sharp. He blinked, leaned back, and whispered to himself, "It's working." That evening, he read aloud to his granddaughter without faltering. Her laughter at the funny parts felt like music, sweeter than any hymn. Week 4 brought confidence. The capsules were no longer a strange experiment, they were a ritual. He paired them with his walks, with his new colorful meals, with the slow, steady rhythm of a man tending his body the way he tended his roses. His eyes began to meet the world with less strain. The glare of headlights softened, the colors of the garden deepened, even the faces at church seemed clearer, expressions easier to read. Life itself felt nearer, less hidden behind fog. By week 5, the change was undeniable. Mary noticed it most. "You're not reaching for your glasses as often," she said one evening. Ulysses hadn't even realized, but she was right. The pair that once clung to his bedside table, his newspaper chair, his car dashboard now sat unused more often than not. He still kept them nearby, habit was hard to break, but more and more he found himself leaving them behind. His hands, once reflexively adjusting frames, were free. Week 6 felt like a revelation. Ulysses stood in his garden, the morning sun glistening on dew, and for the first time in years, he saw the details without reaching for lenses. Each petal, each vein, each shimmer of light was his to claim. He closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again, half afraid it would all blur away. But it didn't. The clarity stayed. And with it came something more powerful than sight. freedom. He thought back to the doctor's office, to the words spoken with such finality. You'll need stronger lenses, likely for the rest of your life. And here he was, 6 weeks later, standing without them, reading without them, living without them. Not perfectly, his vision still carried age's fingerprints, but free enough to feel alive again. The journey wasn't just about eyesight, it was about what the glasses had come to represent: dependence, limitation, decline. To set them aside, even for a while, was to reclaim pieces of himself. He felt younger, not in body, but in spirit. He felt capable again, independent, alive in ways he hadn't realized he had lost. Mary noticed it too. "You smile more," she said softly one evening. "You laugh more. It's like you're seeing me again." He looked at her, his eyes sharp in the glow of lamplight, and whispered, "I never stop seeing you. I just see you clearer now." She pressed his hand, tears glistening, and in that moment, he knew the 6 weeks had given him more than sight. They had given him love renewed. His granddaughter was the final proof. She handed him a book one afternoon, certain he would falter, as he often did. But as he read, the words flowed, steady and sure. When he finished, she clapped her hands and shouted, "Papa doesn't need glasses anymore." He laughed, scooping her into his arms, and in her joy, he felt the full measure of his victory. 6 weeks, that was all. 6 weeks of capsules, of walks, of faith in something new. 6 weeks to shift from despair to hope, from blur to clarity, from dependence to freedom. The path hadn't been dramatic, it had been steady, faithful, rooted in the small choices that built each day. And those small choices had changed everything. Now, as he looked at the glasses folded neatly on the table, Ulysses didn't throw them away. He kept them, a reminder of where he had been, a symbol of the path he had walked. But he no longer leaned on them. They were tools, not masters, and that, he thought, was the greatest gift of all. For Ulysses, the 6-week path was more than a health routine. It was a story of resilience, of discovery, of life still waiting to be seen. And as he prepared for the weeks ahead, he knew this was not the end, but the beginning, a new chapter written in clarity, in color, in hope. Ulysses' journey began with something so familiar, a bottle of castor oil, a nightly ritual, and the quiet hope that tradition could hold back the tide of age. But as the days blurred and the newspaper words slipped further from his grasp, he discovered what so many seniors eventually realize. Comfort isn't always the same as healing. From that first moment of doubt, his story unfolded like a lantern lighting a path. He faced the truth that vision loss was not his burden alone. It touched nearly everyone his age. Yet instead of surrendering to statistics, he uncovered a hidden report, a secret too often left unspoken. That bilberry seed oil, rich in anthocyanins and omega fatty acids, could do more than soothe. It could nourish, restore, and protect. One capsule at a time, Ulysses embraced a habit that changed everything. His eyes grew steadier, his colors brighter, his nights less clouded. But the gift went beyond vision. His heart grew stronger, his skin softened with glow, his digestion calmed, his memory sharpened. Each step revealed not just clearer sight, but clearer life. And along the way, he discovered he was not alone. Countless seniors across the country were reclaiming clarity, proof that age does not always mean decline. In just 6 weeks, Ulysses found freedom. Glasses became tools, not chains. His granddaughter's stories returned in full color. His wife's face shone sharper than ever, and in that clarity, he rediscovered love, dignity, and hope. To every senior listening, remember this: your story is not finished. Your body is still capable of renewal. Sometimes, change doesn't come in grand gestures, but in one small habit, chosen faithfully each day. Like Ulysses, you can still step into light, clearer, brighter, stronger than before.